Good, done. All right. So, turn this around. Normal. So, domestic terrorism is a major issue, and then when we've been talking specifically in here about technology and how I think someone had said an actor in their basement, or somebody, you know, like a rogue agent in their basement doing something major with advances in technology. And we talked about the potentials of a rogue state with advanced technology, creating a bunch of havoc. And technology in general, what might happen in the future could probably up the ante. Someone messing around with nanoparticles, somebody messing around with bioengineered organisms in their basement. You know, these things are becoming more and more cost-effective to do, and a lot more widespread. So just to give you one right out of the gate example before I talk about this fun stuff and get to the joke, is just to kind of whet the appetite for the discussion tonight, is that you can now very easily with a low-cost 3D printer, and Ben knows a lot about this type of thing, is there's plans now available online for firearms that you can 3D print. And
that are undetectable.
Yes, yes. So I probably, with a lot of you guys out there, probably agree with me that that might not be the best answer. But you know, these are the kind of things that are becoming more and more possible and more prevalent, and they're going to get cheaper and cheaper, and so basically impossible to stop inevitably. Okay, so unless we could think of some creative ways to stop that, which is part of today's discussion. So continue on here. Oh, next I want to introduce this. So what's happening is that the time that I'm speaking right now is being ticking up. If you look on the board, you'll see on the lower left-hand corner there's a little timer blinking, and it might be hard to see, but Shamelis can see it, and and Tiffany. And so as the MC, I'm just in there by name, but you know, I have my time is ticking up, and the way this is there's statistics below that screen in kind of like a spreadsheet style format thing that shows my total talk time relative to everybody else's, and it gives percentages and everything like that. So if 2 people or 3 people or 4 people or 5 people or all of us want to speak, the person with the lowest talk time, total talk time, gets the precedence in the speaking queue. What do you think?
Good.
Clever?
Yeah, let's try it.
Clever?
Bill wins.
Yeah. So
I'm second.
So when actually everyone, Shamelis right now should be not in queue because no one's raised their hand yet. So everyone should actually be down in the not in queue place, not in the speaking queue. You have it all right, but that's just those names have to be brought down. So what happens is if you are in the speaking queue and then you speak, Shamelis will take you out of the speaking queue and put you out of the queue. And then if you want to speak, you raise your hand and you go back in the queue in your ordinal position. Right? So this is going to be 2 levels advanced from this in the future if we like this, which I think we will. One, Shamelis and I are programming a thing for our own to do this with our own software. This is pre-canned software that we're going to do it manually to see if it works. But we've designed, if you look on the board behind you, we've designed over the last couple of days in our free time, which doesn't exist, we've designed this software to do this exact thing for us, which is like super cool. And then if that really kicks off well, we're actually going to have a speaking gadget. It's a radio frequency gadget that I found online that's super cheap to make and build. You buy the kit and you put it together. And what you do with that is you press the button to raise your hand, right? So you say, I want to speak, and that's then going to talk to the software. And then when you're speaking, it'll automatically record your time. And then lastly, it'll have a way to vote on it as well. So we'll propose questions, and like you give your opinion, and the whole group gives their opinion anonymously, and then the statistics come up on screen of the voting percentage, agree, disagree, etc.
Do the virtual people in the meeting get to vote too?
They do and they don't. Right now, the virtual people don't really apply because there's so few. There's like maybe 1 or 2 during the thing, and they're quiet. There's only been 1 or 2 comments. So as of right now, it doesn't really matter. But if it did matter, we'd find a way to integrate that as well. So you know, technology bringing it in to try to do some cool stuff. Yeah. So I hope you enjoy it. If not, we'll try something different. That's what it's all about. So domestic terrorism, the theme for today is making a positive change. And obviously this is a big problem. So not that it's a funny topic, but we'll get right into the joke. And the joke for tonight is, did the slide change there? Maybe not. I don't know. There we go. All right, so the joke for today is some vampires. A couple vampires are they'd just gone out in the town and they had gone to several vampire bars. And at vampire bars, they have these people in the back that are vampire groupies. And the vampires go in the back and they go and drink the blood from the groupies, and it's like a symbiotic thing. They all love it. It's all good, right? So these vampires have been out drinking all night, right? And they're really happy. They've pretty much had their fill, and boy, they're flying high. And it's really super late at night, and they're walking back, and they go by the morgue, right? And one vampire turns to the other and says, "How about one more cold one?" Too bad if you don't like it. So that's the vampires in the morgue joke. Yeah.
See that joke? With that joke, you see it coming, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Well, there was nothing about a stiffy or a stiff one or anything like that. That was part 2 of it, but I just said, yeah, first part's good enough as it is.
Right.
So
Worst vampire joke either, can I tell you?
yeah, there's much worse one, not Tiffany.
Oh yeah.
So when we look at domestic terrorism, what is it, right? So domestic terrorism in the U.S. consists of incidents confirmed as terrorist acts. These attacks are considered domestic because they're carried out by U.S. citizens or U.S. permanent residents, right? So we have to then get into this kind of idea on what exactly is a terrorist act, right? So I did that very next thing as a definition for that, just to make the conversation make sense. And so the use of violence or threats to intimidate or coerce, especially political purposes. Especially for political purposes. It doesn't mean it has to be for political purpose, but especially for. The state of fear and submission produced by terrorism or terrorization, or lastly, a terrorist method of governing or of resisting a government. So what's interesting, that's an interesting use of the term. So someone who's resisting a government, quote unquote freedom fighter, right? Or quote unquote somebody who is resisting the legal entity of government would actually by all counts and all definition be considered a terrorist.
No,
As by this definition.
only one who, well, it's a wrong definition because they're only a terrorist if they commit an act to terrorize.
A terrorist method of governing or of resisting a government.
But you still have to commit an act. Standing on the street corner and talking about the government and how wrong they are isn't terrorism. It's a way of resisting the government.
Right. I think you might have to fuse together both 3 and 1. That the resistance would be violence or threats to intimidate.
So,
Are those 3 separate definitions? Because if so,
within dictionary.com, it's just definitions 1, 2, and 3. How they do that.
But I mean, in other words, if each of those can be a definition by itself, then you've got the what's being defined in the definition, terroristic method.
So we're rejecting definition 3 as an invalid or not accurate definition?
I think that you have to put all 3 of them together to get at
Okay.
what terrorism is.
So we'll look at it as a composite kind of explanation. Fair enough. Cool. So we'll be looking at, I'm going to take a particular orientation on this. I think that will be very appealing to you guys tonight as well. So I wanted to immediately go over to this bad boy. And so there's the definition of terrorism for you. And I wanted to get into this list, which is fascinating to me. And it might be difficult for you to see, and if it is, that's okay. Well, what we're kind of going through here is what we're looking at. Is we're looking at this long, very long historic list in the United States, okay, of acts of what we consider domestic terrorism by that definition. And all the way from anti-abortionists. As you see, this is a Wikipedia article. And when I came into here and saw this, I was like, I have to put this in the presentation, because I was familiar with a couple of these, but I had no idea it was this vast. And I'm going to take it to where it's even more extreme than this in a second, and I'll explain why as well. So we have like a definition which we kind of went through, and we go from all the way to anti-abortionists to the eco-terrorism, the extremes of you know, people going through and torching new developments, you know, that are in pristine land or what lands were former state property and stuff like that. The government will change their rules and allow a certain territory to be developed, and some of these eco-terrorists will come in and like torch. I was reading about that. Those guys will come in.
Bureau of Land Management.
Yeah.
Right.
And just
Wait a minute, that really doesn't conform to either of the three things on terrorism. It didn't, in those definitions, nothing was mentioned about property.
well, it's using threats and intimidation, I would say, right? That's pretty intimidating to me. Seeing this.
Against property?
Well, yeah, sure.
Okay.
So if I was in my house at night and somebody went by and shot my windows out every night to intimidate me, I would say that would be, even though they're not hitting me with the bullets, I would say.
Well, what if you weren't in your house? They were just going to, torch your house
It's a good
with you
question.
not being in it.
I disagree.
So we did it in this gray area pretty quick. Go ahead, Michael.
There are people for whom the loss of their property is a terrifying consequence.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
not true of you, but it is true of everybody.
Right.
And I know how it happened. It happens because there's a lot of private property in an area that the federal government later designated as like a national park or national monument. And so some places, there'll be a house, it's private property, but it's also, like a national park, so it's just weird legal status. And the Bureau of Land Management wants to end that. They just want all the land that's in the national park. And sometimes that they use tactics to get people out of there. That's what the Earth Liberation Front.
Yeah,
is
that's one of them
fighting.
in this list too, the Earth Liberation Front.
So I'm not convinced that they're a terrorist group.
Fair enough. Ben?
So I think most definition or most exercises to define terrorism in the most general sense quickly arrive at the realization that the single greatest act of terror was the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And a lot of acrobatics are engaged in to try to separate terrorism from the acts that the United States committed on Japan. And generally they fail, and at the end you end up with a loose definition like, it's terrorism if I say it is.
Yeah, right.
Mhm.
Yeah. I've seen that quite a bit actually over the years of that definition being morphed to the circumstances, yeah, for sure.
It seems to me that this is a term that there's not going to be a precise boundary around, but that the main idea is that the act that is being engaged in is designed for the purpose of producing fear in people. So it would be different than like attacking someone because you were angry at the person, or injuring somebody out of revenge or something like that. This is any kind of act to produce fear in a group of people. It seems like. So the first three definitions I think were a little problematic.
Yeah. So, Shamelis, Ben should be the only one in the speaking queue right now, just so you catch up on the technology. So Ben should be in the top list and everyone else should be in the bottom list. Yeah. And just start my timer back, because I'm going to talk about this for a second. And we'll get right to you in just 1 second, Ben, as soon as he sorts that list out. So this domestic terrorism thing, in some regards, especially when you get loose on that definition, to some extent, the perpetuation of the threats of external terrorism that we receive on almost a daily basis. If you're a news watcher, you hear almost on a daily basis this threat of the boogeyman, right? The external terrorist, the Muslim extremist who's coming to get us. And if you want to really bend the definition even more, in a way, that's a form of terrorism right there. That psychological terrorism, inciting the fear within us that another 9/11 is going to happen. And you know, this 24-hour news cycle of, especially when something happens like 9/11, you know, that creates a secondary effect. That's a kind of an indirect terrorism, form of terrorism via propaganda. So I would like to talk about some of those edge cases because I think they're really valuable to, you know, this conversation. So we look at eco-terrorism, right-wing terrorist organizations, then boy, they just go on and on and on. A lot of them are race-related, you know, all kinds of things. Many people are familiar with probably a lot of these. And then the notable, the mountain, we don't have to get into each group, but we'll talk about specifically a couple things like the Oklahoma City bombing and how that contrasts to like the Boston Marathon bombing and then 9/11. So, and we then had this San Bernardino, the Orlando nightclub, which was definitely like homosexual related, you know. And so how this like these hate groups and stuff can get in and create these acts of terrorism. So I had then also, I wanted to stretch, and I'm very aware that you're in the queue, Ben. I wanted to talk about this as this feature, okay, gangs, as a feature of domestic terrorism that should be very much included in the narrative, but for some reason is not. And in studying domestic terrorism, the gang issue really stood out in my mind as why in the world is that not being spoken of as terrorism? It fits the definition better than most other things. So I'm going to try to introduce the concept of bringing gang activity into the fold and should be included in the narrative of domestic terrorism, in my opinion. So I'm going to try to bring that by showing some statistics and some other things. Ben?
So Bill's definition was about causing fear on a group of people. And I think you almost jumped right into it. It's important to look, I think, at both sides of the equation, or in other words, to look at government and see if they are contributing to this, participating in it, or if they're sort of innocent in this, right? And
Sure.
I think you very quickly pointed out that they're playing a secondary role. I think there's been a whole series of acts by the government for the last year that have been intended to strike fear into certain groups of people. People whose skin is dark, generally, in various ways, whether they're immigrants from South America or Muslims, as you rightly noted, refugees escaping the mayhem that we caused, in part, in Syria and other places. So I think the U.S. government does not have clean hands in this. You're right to point out gangs, but I think you missed the police, who I think by all analysis are not really separable from gangs in terms of how they operate above the law, how they engage in non-judicial killings on a persistent basis, how they stick together and identify themselves as the blue code or something like this. And generally their role is to protect one tribal group against another tribal group. And often it's the gangs or the mafia or some other thing, but the realization is that those things, the mafia, the gangs, and other things, are just tribal groups who are engaging in essentially the same patterns of behavior. They're protecting their own, and they're engaging in non-judicial violence as a tool. So at the end of the day, what's the difference? Color, race, things like that. Do the police have more legitimacy? Handsome is as handsome does. They have more legitimacy if they behave legitimately. They don't.
So that brings up kind of this nice little comic here, right? This is from a Huffington Post article, and Huffington Post article is Huffington Post in general tends to usually be quite left-leaning, right? And so here's like the characterization: the Muslim shooter, right, is a terrorist. You know, the black shooter is gang related. It's always that way. The professional shooter, the soldier, is the hero, and then the white person is the lone wolf who probably has emotional issues, right?
Yeah.
So it's like there's a motive sort of tied to the ethnical background of any particular perpetuator of violence, kind of by default, in a way. So it's like this like violent, it's a stereotype that kind of comes with or tags along with the race, right? When there's violence perpetuated. So if a Muslim commits violence of any kind, it's going to be considered terrorism. You get the idea down the line. So I thought that was an interesting characterization. Put out there. And then when we get into this, the article here is Muslims are not terrorists, looking at it from a factual standpoint and a numerical and sort of factual standpoint, right? And so non-Muslims make up the majority of the terrorists in the United States. True, most terrorism here in the United States is domestic based. It's not.
That needs to be on a per capita basis, though.
Of course, yeah, that's true. That's true. If you if you normalize it on a per capita distribution, you would have probably a different outlook than just sheer volume. If you're looking at it from a percentage basis, yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. So remember, this is a very leftist source, and there's another reason why I pulled this up. Because I wanted to point it out. Non-Muslims make up the majority of terrorists in Europe, right? Even if terrorist attacks were carried out by Muslims, you still cannot associate terrorism with Islam. Just statistically speaking, that's a misnomer. That's an incorrect association. It's not a corollary that's strong enough to get it into the realm of fact at all, right? So this is specifically oriented around Muslims, which tend to be our kind of daily dose of propaganda. Definitely comes in this flavor. I mean, at least that's how I see it. Yes, please, Ben.
Well, that's nice, but Islam is a religion that terrorizes its female population pretty heavily.
Okay.
Its book is also fairly replete with...
Can you get into detail about that?
Well, in Saudi Arabia, women are not even allowed to drive until last week. Honor killings is a thing. There are all kinds of restrictions and rules, and women live essentially in the shadow and under the control of their male domineers, if you will, their older brothers, their parents, and then their husband in that religion and in that culture. I think that religions can just have a perpetual state of terror against their females. I think that's a real common characteristic of religions. The Bible is not much better until you get out of the Old Testament. Even there, it's a little sketchy. I think we've tamed Christianity largely by ignoring the Bible, moving beyond it, and Islam is in that. I would say Islam is in that process, but it is behind in terms of becoming a modern religion, and that's reflected in how it treats its women across the world.
So you kind of stretched the definition there a little bit about the terrorism, talking about terrorizing the women within that culture.
I think they are manipulated by fear as a practice,
Gotcha.
which is condoned by their religion on a daily basis. So, yeah, I don't think it's a stretch much.
Okay. So I personally feel as if Islam has been used as a scapegoat for fear mongering by our government to invoke the propaganda machine to allow these things to continue overseas that are clear atrocities by any measure.
They aren't mutually exclusive. Both can be true.
Yes, that's a good point. So when we look at the Middle East and we see these accounts of people living every day with the idea of drone flying overhead that could just kill them at any moment, right? They say cloudy days are like days where they have relief because certain cloud thickness, they can't be they can't be tracked and potentially blown up, you know, by this invisible thing in the sky that you don't even hear coming. And the idea that something was flying over my head that could kill me at any given moment does I can imagine, it doesn't take much of an imagination to imagine that's a pretty terrorized state of existence to walk around. Yeah. We've got Michael and then Ron and Cosmo. So Shamil, is Michael, Ron, and Cosmo should be the only ones in the queue right now?
And Tiffany got missed.
Okay, so Tiffany should stay in the queue. So Michael, Tiffany, and then Cosmo and Ronald should be the only ones. So Shamil, is 8, 9, and 10 should go down into the not in queue because they have not raised hands to get in the queue. Yeah, there you go. So now 8 and 9. Sorry, we're just sorting this out. So make sure Shamil gets the idea here. You're doing good so far. Yeah, perfect. So then that queue right now, one last thing, sorry, Michael. That queue between Michael, Tiffany, Cosmo, and Ronald should be sorted by the lowest talk time. Yeah, so while Michael's talking, you can sort that. Yeah, cool. Please.
The fact is that there's a difference between a terrorist act and organized terrorism. If I beat my wife every time she does anything I don't like, then every time we're in public she's in terror that she might inadvertently do something I don't like, and I'll beat her when I get home. That's terrorism.
I would say so. I think that fits.
But it's not organized terrorism. It's not a group which promulgates acts to achieve a political or religious or economic goal. Or even as in the case in the way members of different cultures treat the women, I don't actually think that Muslims are that much worse than, say, the Hindus and the members of, I mean, they're lighting women on fire in India. I find that fairly terrifying. So no, it's
Is that
not.
a defense of Islam?
What?
Is that a defense of Islam?
No, but I'm saying that we have seen this codified, organized thing that goes on in the Middle East, which, you know, I mean, they have police who will beat women in public just for not wearing the right clothes. And yeah, I think that's pretty harsh.
Sounds organized to me too.
It's very organized.
That's
Whereas in India, it's not so organized. But they light them on fire. I find that more terrorizing. I think that you need to decide how much is the act and the motive. What makes it terrorism? Is it the act or the motive? And when it's just the motive, there's an awful lot of things where, well, I'd have to go find the guy and find out first before I'd need to know whether it was just he's a wacko who likes to hurt people or he had something he wanted done differently. Which is why I object to all of the concentration on motive in our current furor for order, which we call law and order, but we're not really interested in the law part. We just want to go and not have my imaginary orbital mind control lasers targeting me during the day. I don't think we need to worry about motive so much. I think we need to talk about our behavior. I think we need to say that if you threaten women in public because you don't like the way they talk, well, I think you just committed assault. And I don't care why you committed assault. I want you to do your year in a jail and a day in jail for it.
Tiffany, you're up.
I'm gonna pass.
Okay.
It's kind of gone. What I was gonna say is kind of gone.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. Cosmo.
I think the worldwide statistics is 1 in 3 women suffer from domestic violence in their life. It seems that is probably the highest ratio of any domestic violence that goes. So that women's issue is a huge one. And even in the military, 1 out of 3 women are raped, which can be considered as a violence. But back to what Michael was saying, that he cares about the act, not so much the motive. I think you got to care for both. I think that once the act occurs, then you have to backtrack on the motive to find out exactly why it occurred. And I think that you have to take that into account when you assign blame. And I think that if we're going to be looking at what are the roots of terrorism, seems like it's hate. And hate is a motive. It's a mind state. And so the question then becomes, well, how do you catch it before somebody acts out on it? And to kind of like cut down on the terrorist acts by identifying it beforehand.
So, Ronald, you're up.
Well, I wanted to say 2 things. First of all, regarding the drone strikes, the drone strikes are just wildly illegal. There's no legal structure. And the one thing I didn't like about Obama is that he just greatly expanded the drone strikes with no significant debate here. And I wouldn't be surprised if drones are already flying over us with something like the Las Vegas shooter being used as a justification.
Sure.
But that's one thing. The other thing is that what we're talking about when it comes to terrorism is here in America we have something called a hate crime, meaning if you assault somebody because you hate them, that's worse than just assaulting them. And it's very hard to get your mind around that. It's very hard for that to make any sense.
Right.
And it's the same debate as, is terrorism murder or something else?
You raise an interesting point. So imagine if someone goes and assaults somebody for fun, right? And then assaults person B out of hatred. In theory, they would serve more time for doing it associated with the hate, right? There's an extra penalty if it's labeled a hate crime. Is that my understanding that right?
Yeah.
So if someone was really psychotic, and not that that's not doing it out of hate is still psychotic, but someone that does that out of fun because they just felt like it, right? Would then theoretically serve less time than, to your point.
Yeah.
Ben?
No, I think we're wandering off a bit. It's not that there's an extra penalty because of motive. There's a recognition between the federal system and the state system that certain states have normalized hatred. And that because of that, if somebody were to drag somebody to death behind a truck because they happen to have the wrong orientation until they died, in a community which is dedicated to the Bible, which justifies in their eyes that sort of thing, the local jury might justify that act, and there would be no penalty for the act itself. But the federal government actually has a backstop for that in the form of hate crime legislation, which makes it a federal offense and therefore adjudicatable under the federal justice system. So there would be a jury impaneled at the federal level that could look, and outside that community, and presumably somewhat more separate in terms of their biases. So it's slightly more difficult, slightly more complex than just saying it's worse if you do it with a motivation. This is more about jurisdiction and about dealing with the fact that in this country for many years, black people would go below the Mason-Dixon line, get the daylights beat out of them, and or killed, And juries would say, well, he deserved it. And so we have proper legislation to address that, as we should.
Michael?
And I think that's why the system has not improved nearly as much as we would all like to believe, is because what if you're Zoroastrian and have an albino complexion? Does that make it okay? Or are you a protected class? That means that the law is designed to protect a subset of the population, not the entire population. And I find that to be just another half step towards a set of unworkable laws. And if you're on the jury, yeah, maybe you think it's okay to beat up uppity niggers, but the fact is, it's not illegal. It is illegal to do so. And if the law is written so that the penalty is for the crime committed in order to protect the society, then that, if it in fact becomes a consequence rather than a penalty, no, I'm not trying to punish you for your hate, your racist hatred and your intransigent religious belief. I'm trying to keep you away from the rest of the population because you're freaking dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And that until such time as you're not dangerous, I would like you to be walled off from everybody else, because they don't need to put up with you. So instead of heading that way, we try to decide in law who's more hideous. A guy who murders for the yahoos of it, or a guy who murders because of a sense of racial purity or religious I mean, I don't care why he murders. I really honestly don't care why he murders. I just don't want him to have as much opportunity to murder people as he used to. That's all I care about. And when you start doing all of that stuff, that now I got a prosecutor has to decide what to call this crime of this poor dead body on the ground with a knife in its back. Because what was that, a hate crime? Or is that terrorism? Or, you know, it's a dead guy with a knife in his back. It looks like murder to me. Why does it matter? Why is it important? Are we going to keep him away from the rest of the population for less time?
Because history, that's why.
Yeah, okay, but the fact is that it doesn't make it more likely that the person will be kept away from society for longer, because there's just more things for the lawyers to argue about. And then I get mitigation because, well, of course he doesn't like black people. His mother was gang raped by a black gang. And I get to bring that in as if it had some sort of justification for murder. And it doesn't, but it does to juries. Well, we need to put it back into the law. You stick a knife in a guy's back, you've committed murder.
That's not necessarily the case.
You stick a knife in a guy's back, it's really highly likely that you committed murder, and you'd have to prove that you had a reason to be afraid that he was not running away from you, but was going to get his gun. I don't know. But that's all argument to fact, not argument to opinion. I don't want arguments about opinions in court.
Steve?
In answer to your question, it could be an appropriateness issue as to, did the person that got killed deserve to be killed? To what degree did they deserve to be killed? If they did something that prompted their murder, then the punishment would be less. But if they were a totally innocent victim, then maybe the punishment should be greater. It's a matter of retribution.
Cosmo?
I want to shift a little bit to fighting terrorism, the idea of fighting terrorism. To me, that involves kind of like a contradiction, because the fighting is terrorism itself. So in a way then, that terrorism begets terrorism. Now, for some examples, when you've got a terrorist threat, then you create a counter-terrorist organization. Okay, and so just recently, Black Lives Matter has been entered into the FBI as a terrorist organization. They're now called the Black Identity. What is it? Black Identity
Front.
Extremist. That's
Extremist.
Black Identity
Extremist.
Extremist. So now they've become a terrorist organization.
Black Panther.
Okay, so now you've got the Black Lives Matter as a terrorist organization, and now you've got, well, the counter is that Blue Lives Matter.
Right.
Okay, and so now you've got kind of like the people that are now attacking Black Lives Matter. They're terrorizing Black Lives Matter and doing it under the banner of Blue Lives Matter. So that becomes a terrorist organization. So it's kind of like you're creating a feedback loop of terror. And that just accelerates the terrorism. So now you've got, I saw a Afro-American guy holding a sign that says, "White supremacy is terrorism." Okay, so now we've got part of that feedback loop going back and forth and back and forth, and it's just accelerating. So I don't think that you can fight terrorism, because fighting is terrorism, and that just feeds into the feedback loop. That's it.
Bill?
I guess several kind of separate ideas. But one thing, I don't think it is at all clear what is meant by hate. And maybe it is to other people, but how one would distinguish hate from just a lot of anger or something like that. But what we do is we use these words, these categories, so that we can do what we want to do. I think that Michael's focusing on the difference between punishment and quarantine, essentially, is an appropriate consideration. In other words, it seems quite true that it would be important to quarantine individuals who were dangerous by virtue of the tendencies that they demonstrated that they have. The issue of punishment is entirely separate, and it seems like punishment is terrorism in a sense. It's more than that. Punishment is revenge, for one thing, but it's also terrorism to terrorize other people from, to prevent them from doing what this person did. But you wouldn't call it that because you're trying to terrorize people who you believe should be terrorized into not doing what they are trying to do. So I think a lot of what we're dealing with is just kind of linguistic distinctions that we try to make in order to do what we want to do. And if we have a strong need to punish, or if we have a strong need to get revenge on a particular group, then we're going to use some kind of label that will allow us to do that. But again, maybe what is hate? Are we all? Does everybody know what hate is? And how is it different from just lots of anger?
Well, hate is really just not understanding other cultures, other people, other religion.
Hate is not understanding?
Yeah, it's not. It's based on not understanding it.
So if I don't understand a group, then I have hatred?
It can possibly lead to that, yes.
Okay, what is the hatred?
But you have a choice. You can read about it.
Yeah, but well, you're saying that if it's based upon
Yeah.
lack of understanding, then you would call it hate. Otherwise, it's just anger.
You have a choice.
Yeah.
If you don't understand something, you could research it, or you could just not research it and just hang out with other people who don't understand Muslims, and you got like an echo chamber effect, and you know, something
So
like
it's
that.
still not, I don't get what you're saying hate is.
Hate is ultimately based on someone not understanding something, and they don't, for whatever reason, research it and try to understand it. You know, like you've got all kinds of people here trying to say that, you know, Islam is a bad religion. Well, I guarantee you those people have not made any attempt to study it.
Well, does that mean that they are hating? Why are they just
That
not
means that they're
educated?
choosing to do that instead of trying to get a genuine understanding of the topic.
Choosing to do what?
Choosing to just stay in a bubble.
But that doesn't sound like hate. It doesn't have anything to do with anger or violence or intimidation or anything. That's just not having information, not being educated.
Right, but
where does hatred come in?
Because you've got all these people on the internet who just, that's what I said, echo chamber, where they're making assertions that aren't true, and it just bounces around, you know, all the like right-wing websites on the internet, like the Daily Stormer.
So you're saying that being incorrect is hatred? It doesn't
Probably
sound
lead
like-
to it, I think is.
I think it can lead to it. yes.
But it
Okay,
isn't
lead
it.
to it.
It isn't it. That's what he's saying.
It isn't it, no.
It isn't
But it's a
it.
contributing factor.
He wants to know what it is.
Right, exactly.
I think I'll try to define that when it's my turn to speak. It's Ben is up next.
Yeah, so I think that hate is not really the most accurate word in the context. It's sort of like what's left when you reduce it down and we say it's a hate crime. What we really mean is something a little bit more verbose. And generally it means that the target of the crime was not chosen because of personal animosity, but because they were a member of a group, and the person has animosity against an entire group, and that person just happens to be a representative. So if, for example, you happen to hate people in blue shirts, and you find somebody in a blue shirt, and you just visit all of your pent-up anger on him, that is what we define as a hate crime. I think in the most general sense that gets at it. But I to your point, unfortunately, I don't think Islam holds up to study and evaluation. I have good friends who are Muslim, but it doesn't really make it a better religion. It's got fundamental problems.
So does Christianity.
Oh, don't get me started.
So I get to call on myself. This is awesome. There's this idea of internalized racism. Someone that can actually become, to the point, so disdainful towards the past actions of their race, or what they see their own race or group doing, that they internalize that so much so that they end up even being self-racist against their own, themselves and others like them, and that they consider in their group. It's internalized racism is the term for that. And I have a friend of mine who I've been debating with for quite some time, who is picture perfect that, right? And he's a southern white gentleman who is all up into the Black Lives Matter thing, and is just this hater, and says that white people are the problem. And I wish I had arguments besides bringing up how there's all types of groups that have bad information, going along the lines of what you were saying, Ron, with the inaccurate information can very quickly lead to hatefulness because of just not understanding. I think that is a good way to say it as well. It's a definitely contributing factor, I think one could argue. And so in his particular case, I don't feel as if I have much fuel to combat what he's saying, right? Because I can come up with a case that middle-aged white guys are the worst, are the scariest ones, right? To some extent. The serial killers and the guy that just opened fire in Nevada, and Tim McVeigh, and on and on and on we go. You know, the Waco thing, the David Koresh, and all these people just come up, and you know, we see this in the news over and over and over and over. And it might be biased because of the population thing, as Steve pointed out. I think that's a good way to look at that data as well. So yeah, I wouldn't mind, you know, talking a little bit about that. So Michael's next.
Okay, I hate astrology. I really do. I mean, this is a belief system that not only requires willful ignorance, but extols willful ignorance as if it were a virtue. And if somebody tells me they want to know my sign, then I already know from the minute they say it, I know I have absolutely no respect for their opinion on anything to do with rational thought, because they want to know my sign. However, I have noticed that the people I know, and I've known many of them who really are into astrology, know an awful lot about people. It's very odd, but they do.
Could it be someone's asking what's your sign because they find you attractive, and that's like kind of a come on pickup line?
Well, it's a way of starting a conversation.
I think that's a fringe probability. Okay, that's not saying it's impossible. It's just not something that, you know.
Mike, what's your sign?
Stop.
No, it's yield, actually.
Do not disturb.
I don't hate astrologers. Well, no, if they're professionals, actually I do. I have utter contempt for them. But I don't want to kill them. I don't want to take all their property. I don't want to blow up their little astrology shop.
They would know you were about to do it anyway in advance, so you would never be as successful.
No, those are psychics. I hate them.
They talk.
But that's a different.
They talk to each other. Yeah.
I got a joke for you about that later. But anyway, I don't hate them. I hate the thing. I hate the mindset and this dressed up mythical fallacy that can be pretty instantaneously disproven by anyone who wants to try. And if I tell them my sign and let them cast my horoscope according to the rules of astrology, then I can sit there and laugh in their face while I point out all the things that say about me that aren't true. So yeah, I don't hate the people, but I do hate the so-called body of knowledge. However, I still think that it's okay to hate things. It's just not okay to go around hurting and killing people. Once again, I come back to the same thing. I don't care what the fuck you think. What did you do? What you did was blew up a building that had people inside of it. Okay, that's called mass murder.
Was it the words that led to those actions, though? So yes, actions speak louder than words, but is it the words that lead to those actions?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think the thing that leads to those actions is the following thing. Everybody get out a piece of paper and see how long it takes you to write down the names of mass murderers. How long before you get to 5 or more? Now, turn the paper over and write down the names of their victims.
Or Nobel Peace Prize winners.
No, I want the names of the victims of the mass murderers. Mm-hmm. So, I bet you most of you aren't going to get to 5. And they're mass murderers, so you know there's enough. The people who do this, a great, large, nobody ever checked proportion of them, do it so to get their name in paper and on TV. That's why they do it. And they want to do it because everybody talks about them.
And they're Southern.
Huh?
And they're Southern.
No, that's just around here. There's lots of mass murderers that aren't Southern. But it isn't, it's an easy problem to fix, except that it takes everybody doing it. And that is, never respond to any organization, product, news, or service that gives me the name, and God help me, the opinions of a mass murderer.
So if a bunch
If
of,
every mass murderer knew, or every potential one, knew that his name would never be spoken again, and his opinions would be ignored, the ones that were doing it because of their opinions, the true terrorists, would find something else to do.
Good point. Steve?
So why do we respect organizations that put forth the name of God, who is the most mass murderer of all?
Ah. Can you expand on that?
Well, it's,
Okay, the flood, how many people died in the flood?
A lot, I would assume.
how many died in the flood?
Jericho, Amalekites,
So,
Egypt.
And
so in that authority / hierarchy / moral authority type situation, though, there's no human being is, under that paradigm, no human being has the reason to judge that. Like, you wouldn't have you wouldn't have the mind to comprehend or to adequately judge that. Would be how it would be. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that's what someone would say to that. Who's next?
So who are we to judge God?
Yeah, that's I think is the counter argument to that. Yeah. So the who's next?
Well,
Shemelis?
why not us? Because we created God.
Oh, no.
Fair enough. Ronald?
No.
Okay. You're next. Oh, you didn't. Hand wasn't up. Oh, okay. Cosmo.
Okay. I think one of the things the third one, terrorist method of governing or of resisting the government.
Mhm.
It's kind of like, with our government in cahoots with the military-industrial complex, they're the ones that define who are terrorist groups that they're actually going to make terror on in that
Right.
feedback loop that I
Right.
specified
There's a list from what I
earlier,
understand.
yeah. And so I have to look at that and admit to you all that I am a terrorist. On February 23rd of 2004, at the National Governors Association meeting in D.C., United States Secretary of Education Ron Page called the National Education Association a terrorist organization.
Ooh.
And I was a member.
Oh,
Yeah.
terrible.
So I have that list actually. If you all want to.
Now, the other thing I have to admit, I am a member of Greenpeace. I send them lots of money,
Oh.
and they're a terrorist organization. Eco-terrorist. Oh, and I have to admit again, I'm a member of PETA. That's the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. I send them a lot of money, and they're on the terrorist list.
Well, yeah, they destroy research facilities.
Oh my gosh, I'm so ashamed. So ashamed that I'm a terrorist.
I have that list up here. These are foreign. This list comes from U.S. State Department. Foreign terrorist organizations, Bureau of Counterterrorism, as you pointed out, the counterterrorism term. And this is very, very large.
Yeah. Well, I would like to say one thing about that. Regarding the NEA, my wife was a member because she was a teacher for 20 years, and every year they send out a membership renewal form that's very confusing as to how much you're supposed to send. So.
And there's this is interesting too, there are some terrorist organizations that become delisted. They get off the list. So that's just kind of funny.
What about domestic terrorist organizations?
Yes, I don't have the official list. I used the Wikipedia before for that listing. Yeah.
Cosmo, you weren't a member of the algebra subgroup of the NEA, were you? They're the
No,
really
not that I
dangerous.
know of. But that wouldn't prevent people from lumping me into them.
So that's interesting on this whole affiliative terrorism or terrorism by proxy. We can talk a little bit about that too. But who's next? Ben?
So Michael is consistently insistent that the motives don't matter. An example given was blowing up a house. And the United States military just marched itself through half of the Middle East, blowing up houses. We generally don't think of our military as engaging in a crime unless they're engaging in a war crime. I know it's a fine line, but it seems to me that for almost everybody imaginable, motives do matter in that context. And certainly in the case of self-defense, motives matter. So I think at the end of the day, it's impossible to separate the problem of the issue of motive from the act. Why it happened is very important.
Should I answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're up next.
International law, national policy, and military policy are separate jurisdictional areas, and we were starting with the idea of hate crimes and terrorist crime definitions in our criminal code. However, I think it's pointless to try to say that having the United States Army go through towns and blow up a house here and there isn't terrorism. And if people who were not shooting out of the house die in those explosions, I happen to think that they've committed murder. But I have no jurisdiction. If they do it in the United States, then I voted for people who are supposed to have jurisdiction over this, and I consider failing to act on that jurisdiction to be malfeasance of office. But I'm in a minority, and I've been here so long I actually have a small house in the minority. I don't think that having a whole bunch of people on your side changes whether or not you've done something evil. I don't think it has any bearing. And I don't think that why you did it changes the nature of what you did. Yes, you're right. The Army has been going through the Middle East committing murder for the purpose of terror. Yes, we do that. It's called war. And General Sherman, who was an expert on the subject of war, said it is hell. I don't want that to be the yardstick that I use in American criminal courts. Thank you.
Ben.
So jurisdiction is essentially the difference in the United States when it comes to motives across the hate in particular. That is, the federal government has jurisdiction for murder that's conducted with that motive of being against a protected class. And they don't in the case of states, because states deal with murder generally as a state issue. So it is a question of jurisdiction in this country. But you have the case of justifiable homicide, which is often self-defense. The police are often in an awkward spot. Not as often as they take the liberties that they do, but they do have to go out and confront people who have guns, because that's who people call when somebody is going about with a gun. And they do take lives. I think in some cases it is more justified than in other cases. But it really, really matters what that justification is. And to say that it just doesn't matter, I think misses a very important point at the end of the day.
Cosmo.
I think that that war and the terrorism, I think that war is terrorism. And then when you have war, it's going to blow back on you. So the terrorism that you create out there eventually gets back at you. And you can see that with the militarization of the police. You've got SWAT teams. I think Trump has now reauthorized the disposition of military equipment to the police forces now. And then you have people who were in the military and even in torture situations coming back now and becoming part of the police organizations now. And so that kind of like military mentality that was used over there against the Muslims is now coming back, and it's now being used within our own borders. That's when the terrorism comes back at you. It seems like any time that you have a war, you take the worst behavior of your enemy and you bring it back onto yourself. Strange, but that's what happened after World War II, when we took a lot of the Nazi scientists and brought them back into the United States. And it also happened with the Japanese. We exonerated them for their biological warfare and took what they knew about it. In other words, we corrupted ourselves after Second World War. And I think that's what happens in every war. When you, especially wars of aggression, but maybe even every war, that you sell your soul, you kind of like reduce your ethics to a more brutal level. And so that's part of the idea where the terrorism that you inflict on others comes back at you.
Ben.
So I think there's a tendency to over-apply the word terrorism, and words, if they apply to everything, suddenly lose their meaning. I think it would be handier if we had a workable definition for terror or terrorism that distinguished it in some meaningful and useful way from the kinds of other things that we're talking about. Not because one is better than the other, one is more justified than the other, one is more preferable than the other, but because it's useful to have words that have a particular meaning. And so in the case of war, as an example, war is an interesting kind of conflict in that there is, at the end of the day, while it's violent, there is a formality about war. War requires, before Reagan anyway, a war required a country as an object of that war. And there was also a goal. There were terms. There was a war as a way of prosecuting for a well-known outcome. So you're saying, we are here, we exist, this is our leader, and we are at war with you. You exist, that's your leader. We are going to throw our rocks and our sticks at you, and you're going to throw your diseased cows at us, until your leader talks to our leader and we come to better terms about our border and about sharing the water and about the raids that you've been running at night on our sheep and all of this. And we want to be better neighbors. And so we're going to throw rocks until you capitulate and either wipe us out, or we come to better terms, or we're going to wipe you out. But in almost all cases, they have a war until there's an understanding. So there's a prosecution for peace, if you will. There's a process. There is always an option on the table to come to terms with the other party. There's a way of settling a war. Terrorism is different than a war in the sense that the person or group or whomever is prosecuting terrorism is usually a non-state actor, doesn't have a postal address, doesn't have any representation, doesn't have an embassy or an ambassador, doesn't have that person, doesn't have a demand. That
that there's nothing in particular they want from you. They're just lobbing rocks and without reason. And I think that that is an important way in which terrorism is separate from war. And without that, I think all war is terrorism. And in that context, I think we can understand. I think what bothers us about terrorism is that it seems to have no purpose. It has no goal. There's nothing you can do. There's no way you can appease whomever is applying terror because they don't even exist in any identifiable way. Their existence is largely hidden or secretive or and so forth. So that's just a distinction I would make, I would offer.
Michael?
I would like to get back to the domestic case again.
Yeah, please. So it's also the part of this is like what possibly might be able to happen about domestic terrorism. So that was another kind of fork of this discussion. So yes, the prevalence of it, why it exists so strongly in the United States, like the most richest nation in the world with the most resources and all these kind of things. Why do we see so many occurrences of it here in America? It should be the least, really, when you look at the opportunity and privilege and all that kind of stuff we have here. And then also, right, what can we maybe do about it? You know?
Well, in an
I'm going to
aside
say, I
answer
think
to
Michael
your
is
aside-
right on this one.
In an aside answer to your aside interruption, I'm going to say, quote Jefferson.
I am the moderator.
I'm going to quote Jefferson Airplane.
Yeah.
All your private property is target for your enemy. But that it's not. Why do they hate the richest country in the world? Well, I mean, who are you going to hate? It's a poor schmuck that's got nothing.
Bangladesh.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and you don't have to hate them. They got tides that can take them out.
It's like
Okay, but the fact is that when I get down to hate crimes, terrorism crimes, and all of these various associations of finding a different name for a thing that's already a crime. And I think there is a crime that is being committed in each of those cases that's never mentioned. And that is the flouting of the authority of justice by the people in the system. That's the thing that's wrong, that makes us want to pass these laws that then cause us to go after the perpetrators of ordinary murders and spend a lot of time and effort proving some nebulous association that's almost impossible to prove. We don't need that. What we need is every single time a citizen or a non-citizen resident in the United States dies in police custody or during a police action, we need to have a federal review board that automatically and irrevocably has jurisdiction over the investigation to determine whether or not the police acted appropriately or the judge acted appropriately. Everybody through the line. And that takes it out of the jurisdiction where we have suspicions that everybody there hates Jews or everybody there doesn't like Yankees or whoever they are, whoever they hate. Well, that's a good answer. But this coming up with this way to label the crimes that are already crimes, all it does is create an opportunity for more time spent by more lawyers doing the same things they were already doing. I think it's pointless, I think it's wasteful, and I think it makes it possible to turn a lot of marginally intelligent people into dupes of some cause that they had no idea they were a dupe of that cause. They'd never even thought about that. But hey, you know, if I got folks on my side, they're on my side. So yeah, I'll become a white pride fanatic. Yeah. I just don't think so. I think you did it because, and also it takes, what we don't have is the finding the most hideous of all motives for murder would seem to me to be murder for profit. I mean, if I was going to pick a list, you know, I did it for the money. I did it because he was keeping me from making money. I did it because he had money. Well, okay, if we're going to talk about heinousness in motivation. The fact that I was raised in a family that taught me to hate anybody that wasn't like my family or like from my neighborhood, well, that's an unfortunate thing, and it doesn't excuse what you did. But what you did was you committed murder. And that's a pretty serious offense, by the way. And no, your justifications don't count as justifications. They don't count in mitigation. Your opinions don't matter. It was the act. And when you're a police officer and you did this, and you say that you did it because you were afraid, so you shot through the window of his car 13 times. Okay, I'll buy that as your excuse for the first 2 rounds, maybe 3, 5, but 13 times? I'm sorry, I'm not buying that. There's hardly anybody that can take 12 rounds in the chest and still be coming at you. And by the way, if there is, well, I would stop shooting at him and think of something else to do. But that's a whole different argument.
Well,
What I'm saying,
you got a plan to go.
well, see, and that's a crime with a name that's already, I don't need to come up with a new name for that crime. That's all of this stuff doesn't need new legislation to make things that we all know are already crimes into crimes. And I don't need somebody to tell the judge that, and for this one, you'll always have this much sentencing. So I can't have a judge who's there say, okay, this poor dumb motherfucker has been talked into this by some slicky people who just had over him. A judge can look at that. That's motive that, okay, I want the judge to take that in mind. This guy's motive isn't even his own. This guy couldn't come up with a motive if he rubbed both hands together as fast as he could. Give me a break. That's where motive should enter. But in terms of defining the crime, stealing, arson's already against the law. And is it more serious? Oh, it's supposed to have a death penalty. I'm not sure how much more serious it needs to be. Torture him to death? No, I don't want to get into that. That's not good for us.
Arson carries a death penalty?
Yes.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Most jurisdictions that have a death penalty, arson carries a death penalty.
Wow.
Because somebody could have been in the house.
And you
That's
can't,
so-
somebody might live in the house next door. Somebody might live in greater Chicago. I mean, who knows what you do when you set a fire? So yeah, it's always been a death penalty. Now, that's first degree arson, which is separated from other types of arson. But the fact is that if you committed arson to get the money from your insurance company, well, you put the entire city of Chicago at risk. And if any of them die, that's arson and murder, regardless of your motive. So we're perfectly willing to look at the fact that it's murder, whatever your motive. We do it in a lot of our laws. If you sit down and come up with a scheme to cheat the bank out of a whole bunch of money, and as a result of that, this old guy comes up with the thing and he's told he can't get his money and has a heart attack and falls to the ground and dies, your guys are guilty of capital murder.
Or felony murder, yeah.
Felony murder. Okay, we can say that it's murder even though it wouldn't ordinarily be murder because some poor guy died. Well, okay, so the some poor guy dying came at the beginning of this one. Why isn't murder good enough? I don't understand why I need to have categories of dead guys on the ground according to what somebody thought about them before they died. I'm sorry, I don't see the logic behind it. And every bit of that logic is, let's speak of this in terms that our modern political system can handle. Every single time you do it, it's really expensive.
Cosmo, you're up.
Okay. Once I'm going to go back to terrorism used to prevent terrorism, and kind of like the governmental terrorism that's used and in coordination with the industrial military complex and think about what they have brought about to fight terrorism, that is terrorism. And during the Vietnam era, it was COINTELPRO, secretive group that was kind of like investigating peace groups, anti-war groups, Vietnam anti-war groups, and Martin Luther King. This time it's got the Patriot Act and we've got the NSA spying on us. So you got all of these organizations that are terrorist groups that are meant to prevent terrorism. Okay, so they define who the terrorist groups are, and eco-terrorist is one of them. And here, let me give you an example of what they consider. Eco-terrorists subscribe to the idea of biocentrism, which is described as a belief that human beings are just an ordinary member of the biological community, and that all living beings should have rights and deserve protection under the law. Okay, so that's what defines the belief structure of eco-terrorists. Now, take a look at how these organizations are terrorist organizations that are trying to prevent us, the eco-terrorists. For instance, with the Dakota Access Pipeline. So you've got the, they've been identified as eco-terrorists. They're also Native American, so we get to continue that kind of terrorism. Two strokes for the government side. So it's kind of like the whole idea of terrorism, like what Michael was saying, why do we have to add on this layer of terrorism that only gets used as an excuse to spy on us and to kind of like wipe out dissent for like eco people who are wanting to save the environment?
I just met with FBI Director Christopher Wray
It should be a word
and Attorney
that's
General.
never been invented.
So that raises an interesting point to me. Right out of the gate, I've been now advocating for quite some time that human beings are special than other creatures on this planet. We have a designation that makes us unique and far superior and more valuable and more precious than any animal.
We invented the distinction too.
That's right. I have a natural bias towards it, right? I have a built-in bias towards human beings. And but there's some empirical biases there's some empirical evidence that could suggest it really quickly out of the gate. You look at how many neurons we have in our brain, how many go to, just you look at our human anatomy and our physiology and how our brains actually work in contrast to other species. And we get into this realm quickly when people start to look at human beings as nothing but just another biological, no different than a bacterium. There starts to become almost no abuse that you can render upon another human being. If you look at them just as a bacterium, you could just crush them the same as you would, a rodent. And that type of thinking, that inaccuracy in thinking, I believe, leads to these type of eco-terrorists. If there's people in needs of resources in competition for animals, I'm sorry, the people are going to have precedence in my mind. And I think that's justifiable empirically, not just sentimentally. And so then I would classify someone that takes the extreme view, that goes to the far extreme, to where they're going to start blowing up human beings because they don't like what's happening to an environment somewhere. That's that they've gone, crossed a serious line. And I think that type of thinking is a kind where we can start to put some definitions around terrorism. When someone has gone to such an extreme viewpoint, right, that they would then use that extreme viewpoint to cause harm to people. I think that starts to push it. That's a reasonable definition for terrorism. Yeah. We got Ben and Michael.
You got me?
You're up on the board.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If you didn't raise your hand, then just say pass and go to
Missed a chance to talk.
I'll pass. I'll pass.
Okay, Michael, you're up.
If you believe that this loose and turbid thinking about biology is an insufficient reason for the actions of eco-terrorists committing, I guess, murder and...
No, that's not really true. They're just putting spikes in trees and stuff like that.
But
Murders.
if you're the guy with the chainsaw...
One person got killed.
Okay, one person got killed, so it's only one count of murder.
Well, that's right.
What I'm asking is, you don't believe that this ecological concern is a sufficient reason to justify that kind of an action.
Right, I don't believe so.
What would be? What sort of philosophy would I have to make it okay with you if I set up death traps and lit things on fire? I don't think there is one. I don't even think that flag and country are good enough for that.
Sure, so there's all kinds of reasons for it. There's plenty of use of justifications of lethal force. We can get into that very easily. That's very easy to justify. There's a wide range of justifications for lethal force to be used against somebody.
Okay, how about arson?
What do you mean, justification for arson? I wouldn't try to come up with one. I probably could be creative and come up with one.
Well,
but
see, because among eco-terrorist things, we talk about the couple of things put into trees, but they've also burned down a couple of country clubs and some things like that, or sinking boats with people on them. You know, I'm saying that if there's a justification good enough for doing something, then the crime was misdiagnosed as murder. Murder means to do it without a legal justification. If you pull a gun and point it at me and I shoot you before you shoot at me, quite aside from the fact that we really need to look at our fashion choices in life, but okay, I haven't committed murder. You committed attempted assault with a deadly weapon.
And you were just defending yourself.
And
right?
I just defended myself. You're deader than hell anyway, no matter how good my justification was. And I have some problems with the fact that I came in to a peaceful meeting packing heat, but that's another whole set of laws. The fact is that when we get down to the religious justifications, everybody loves to misquote the commandment as thou shalt not kill. That's not what it says. It says thou shalt not murder. It's, yes, there are, even in our civilized world.
Actually, if you're more accurate, it says thou shalt not murder another Jew.
Well, see, those are the only people, if you're writing that.
Members of your own tribe.
Yeah. Okay, so we all know that this is all legalism.
Mm-hmm.
And adding a new layer of legalism on top doesn't seem to me to be the choice to get a better world. That's all I'm saying. If it's already a capital crime, why do I need to make it a super capital crime or a hideous capital crime or a double, triple hideous and, by the way, vile? How bad does it have to be? And how good would my motive have to be to make it not a crime? If there's a case where it's not a crime with a certain motive, like defense of an innocent, or those sorts of things, well, okay, those are usually spelled out fairly clearly. They are in the capital punishment sections of murder and assault and battery, and there's a difference between battery and what's the name of, I sat there beating that poor bastard's ass after he went down. That's a different crime than battery. Aggravated battery. That's the one where I punched that guy, he went down, and I kicked him a couple of times, and he was laying there crying, and I just bent over and started punching him. Well, that's aggravated battery, where there is no possible way to say it was self-defense. The guy was on the ground. He was unconscious, and you were still beating his ass. Okay? Or it's like the 13th cop that shot this guy. Are the rest of these guys that bad shots that you're not willing to take a chance that they hit him? Okay, I think all of those things, they cheapened murder. They turned it into a kind of a minor part of the bad thing that you did. but it's the murder that matters. And if you murdered a guy because he's gay, well, you know, I think you'd have to, my view of separation for reasons of protection of society would mean you'd have to stay in prison until you no longer minded other people being gay. And you'd have to pretty much make sure that everybody understood that, you know? You'd have to become an advocate. But that's not likely to be believable, because if you tell somebody he doesn't get out of prison until he joins the I'll go with you club, then he'll join. I don't care what your motive is. I care about your behavior. And if you did it because you're strung out on drugs, well, the guy who forced you to take the drugs was probably guilty of a crime too. But it doesn't change the fact that you're guilty of the crime.
Ben?
So you had raised the topic of preventing terrorism or avoiding it. I think to some extent Michael has the answer here, and that is that ignoring it might be the only thing that really can be done. And it's sort of what Cosmo's been hinting at as well, that you can't really confront terrorism with more of the same and hope to reduce the amount of terrorism.
Because of the feedback loop issue.
But in England during the war, they had a slogan, "Stay calm and carry on." Actually, I think it was never implemented. It was written up, but it's become more popular now. But I think there might be something to this notion that the way to defeat terrorism is to put it in perspective. More people died in car accidents during the same month of 9/11 than died in 9/11, and that was far away the most aggressive act of terrorism. I think it qualifies as domestic terrorism, by the way. These other things are trivial by comparison, and we make of them a much bigger deal than they are. And I think that in doing so, we are feeding the fires. We are creating terrorism as a viable form of self-expression. And the Chinese, you know, have this notion of erasing people from history. And I think that it's probably, you know, a better course of action if you want to minimize this activity. But if you give it wall-to-wall press coverage every time, you're just going to get more of the same, I believe.
We'll always have that because of these 24-hour news networks. So.
Yeah, and the wonderful ads, revenue that it brings. Cosmo? Michael's back in the
Going
game.
back into that, what Ben just said, I'm going to read a little bit from the U.S. Army and Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual. It says, sometimes the more you protect your force, the less secure you may be. Sometimes the more force is used, the less effective it is. And what seems to work is the less force that can be used and the more risk that you are prepared to accept makes it counterinsurgency more successful. And this process she calls, or I guess it's often termed, courageous restraint. So this courageous restraint is like preventing us from getting into that feedback loop of terrorism, counterterrorism, terrorism, counterterrorism. It stops it right there and then. And so I think that has got to be the way that it ends. You got to say, I'm not going to be a terrorist anymore, even to protect yourself from terrorists.
So you need to get out of those terrorist groups that you're in.
You're in a feedback loop.
Steve.
I was thinking about political terrorism. A lot of people, specifically Democrats, liberals, are being terrorized on a daily basis by Donald Trump, the president. When he won, people were sick to their stomachs, and it's been a continuous assault to the liberals. It's ongoing daily shenanigans.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a fact. So the last point that I'd like to raise, since I get to call myself again, which is great, is I want to raise like that blurred line I was talking about. So I had this like statistics here on gangs, and I wanted to bring gang activity definitely into the fold. There's two things, and I found this other cool thing as well, which I'll share real quick. So I'll slide it over and you'll be able to see it. Let's see here. And what this is this is nice little this is a nice little chart. I'll get it on here. Oh, come on. I will get it. Don't worry. 1 second. A little bit of technology. You can't see what I'm doing, so. All right. So this is statistics database of terrorist acts around the world, committed around the world, and you can just look at the heat map here to kind of color coordinate. This is domestic terrorism plus state-sponsored terrorism combined. Interesting chart. And the kind of color of this map, shows where we have these pockets, and a lot of it does line up with a lot with what we'd think. Sub-Saharan Africa, lots of the stuff going on there. The whole drug trade region of the world, the drug producing and shipping and manufacturing region, just loaded with terrorism. And then, of course, Northern Africa and the Middle East. So this lines up with a lot of information that we kind of already have. However, I wanted to get into this really quickly, this notion of this gang related activity. I hope I still have it open. I might not. Crap. It's okay, but I just wanted to show some statistics on, and Michael, you go ahead and I'll bring up those statistics while you make your comment, and then I'll come back.
Or gang?
Yeah, sure, we'll do that.
How do you know
how to end terrorism? There's only one way, and it's not difficult, but it requires everybody, and that makes it very difficult. The way to end terrorism is don't be terrorized. Be courageous. Accept the fact that you are among the wealthiest. You are represented by one of the most powerful governments. You are the most secure that that's going to be true tomorrow on the planet. There's no place on the planet where it isn't more, where it's more likely that your advantages will continue for at least the short-term future. What have you got to be terrorized about? You might die. Someone you love might die. Well, I hate to break it to you, but if you're going to do it by risk factors, the #1 terrorists in the United States are drunk drivers. And the second highest are doctors. Because that's who's killing the most people in the United States. So let's get rid of them. Or let's not get rid of folks because we're afraid of them. Let's live our lives and do the things we need to do and accept the fact that you're not guaranteed that this is going to go on forever. Don't watch. Okay, if there's something I think you can do, and that is if you see on phosphors or in ink anybody give you the name of or tell you the political opinions of a person who committed a major felony, call them up. Before you call, watch the TV screen or look around the printed page to the nearest or next advertisement for products and services. And call that company and the people who made the print and say, okay, heads up, this is a warning. If I ever see that again, I will not buy your product for a year. I will not buy your services for a year. And every time I see it happen, I will double that number.
If people would
Repeatedly.
collectively pull that off, that would have a major effect, there's no doubt about it.
And nothing else would. I don't want them not to report the incident happened. Every place where it says the guy's name, say some unnamed moron, a wild, crazy idiot, some euphemism like that.
Coward.
A coward. Well, all of those things can replace the names. I don't want the government not to try to find out their names. No, they need to know his name. They need to put his ass in jail so I don't have him coming after me. But I don't understand why anyone wants to publish his political opinions. Oh, clear win! Good score! Way to go! That's us committing terrorism on ourselves. If you know the political opinions of Ted Kaczynski, you should thank the New York Times, because they're the ones that published his manifesto at the request of the FBI!
It actually led to his arrest.
Yeah?
That's an interesting piece of study. There's a lot can be gained from that manifesto. It's quite interesting, actually.
Oh yeah, I can quote one of the lines I liked a lot, which was, "The technologists are taking us on a wild ride with no idea where they're going."
Yep. Yeah.
Well, it may be foresaw. If you foresaw artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Very true.
So a gang, organized group of criminals, loosely defined there, and then some gang statistics in the United States. There's some 33,000 violent street gangs, motorcycle gangs, and prison gangs with about 1.4 million members collectively. That's about a third to a half of the veteran population. So that shows how many. It's huge, right? There's 330 million people in America, and there's like 3.4 million veterans or something like that, and there's 1.4 million gang members. That's a pretty big group. Yeah. So the type of things that are showcased on this, you should check this out. This FBI statistics on gangs is quite remarkable. How much power and influence they actually have when you get into there. But anyway, so one of the things I think we could do, just to kind of wrap this conversation up, we're running out of time, and I want to clear our queue before we end. But I want to say that I think some things that we can do were showcased tonight, right? Break the cycle, realizing it's a cycle. Cosmo talking about the positive feedback loop. Michael, you talking about stop perpetuating the machine that feeds into it and profiteers from it and makes so much from that. You know, anger is like sex; it sells. It's a high motivator of people. Anger and fear, especially. Maybe the only thing we really have to fear is fear itself. Maybe that's the actual driving mechanic that's giving us this blowback effect that makes us so we can't break this cycle. This disenfranchisement, when people feel like they're not represented and have no voice and are disenfranchised, that's a seed for a lot of this type of behavior. Someone that sees disproportionality so extreme, like I raised the other, you might have heard me raise in one of these discussions. Kids, Israelis living in Israeli children playing in a water park, while the Palestinian children right across on the other side of the fence have their water rationed, right? These type of grievances lead to certain ways of thinking and really quickly can polarize and entrench people into thinking and get them to inevitably turn to hate and get a really radicalized view, which then could lead to these kind of ideas.
Right.
So,
also, they do that with electricity too.
yeah, yes, great point. So, great, take us home, Steve, and then Ben, and that's it.
Is there a sense of covert terrorism, like an impending sense of doom, free-floating anxiety? We just don't know where the danger is coming from, but we feel afraid.
Yes.
How do we deal with that?
I'm not so sure. I personally deal with it by tuning out of it, and a lot of people say, well, that's willful ignorance. In certain things, I think that that's actually not willful ignorance at all. I think that's an intelligent strategy to manage your own emotions and your worldview. I think us being stewards of our worldview is important. Maybe to some extent to bits what Cosmo's saying, that feedback loop, right? So by selectively censoring to some extent what we do let into our imaginations, will dramatically have an influence over behavior over a long period of time. So what I personally do is that's how I do it. I tune out and consciously to certain things. I don't want to hear about the damn serial killers and the, you know, car on fire. It doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is, like, you know, the things that you guys know me well enough now to know, things I'm interested in.
There's another thing. What about computer viruses? You're afraid to go online because you'll get infected. Then you'll spread the infection.
Or you're being monitored.
Yes.
So you're afraid to look at certain things, which then alters your behavior. Yeah, that's a
You
big.
get added to some list somewhere.
That's right. Yeah, and that could lead to disenfranchisement. That can lead to extreme thoughts as well, paranoia.
Or retribution.
Yes, very good. So we're just about out of time. Ben, you give the final word. You're the last one in the queue.
So I have a different thought.
Awesome.
What if, instead of being afraid of domestic terrorism, we are as a country addicted to it? We need it. We require an enemy. We are bored to the point of dysfunctionality in the absence of a cause. We wake up every morning and look at the news and hope that America has bombed some city in the far off just to feel alive. We long for the days when we were at war with Vietnam or Korea, or if we're old enough to remember World War II, when the news mattered, when nationalism was pulsing through our veins. We felt like we were alive, that we were connected to an organism. We felt like a colony of bees that was all moving in the same direction. And that felt like something that's missing. Every morning we wake up and find out the most exciting thing is that Macy's is having a parade or something. Like, it's unsatisfying. And we might be constitutionally addicted to a certain level of fear. And that if we don't find it, if it doesn't find us, we will find it. And that the reason we gravitate towards these tiny, tiny, tiny little incidences of what we call domestic terrorism, and can't get enough of them, and put them on the front page for weeks on end, is because we actually have an addiction to violence as a nation, and we are in constant withdrawal.
There's a song by Tool called Vicarious that's exactly that. Perfect. Yeah. It's exactly that. It's vicariously we live through watching the whole world die is the idea there. It speaks exactly to what you're talking about. Yeah.
I remember being excited by being with the reporter in the personnel carrier as we're rolling across Iraq, invading Iraq. Just on a daily, hourly basis, here we are rolling across those plains.
So there's psychological component here that might then be a player definitely in this mix. So that's it. That's our time. So what did you guys think about the queue? Is it fun?
I think.
What's the score?
I think the automated queue will be better.
Yeah, automated, yeah.
Because I
That's the
understand
score.
how hard it is to look up. And because all we do is do this, and if you miss it, then you're the bad guy. No, don't worry about it. You're working with a system that I saw right away that you weren't even sure which half we should be in.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I would say, yeah, it needs.
We're figuring it out. You know.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
It's an improvement.
And I noticed that we were all a bit more respectful of, it's not my turn to talk right now.
The order, yeah.
You're on.
So the automated system just, you know, it's just much easier to use. You click one person that's speaking, that shuts the timer off for everybody else, right? So it's one at a time talking, and then you can click around, this person talking now, this person talking, and then the queue is just automatically just sorted by the time. So if you indicate that you want to speak, you go into the speaking queue, and if you have the least amount of talk time so far, you're at the top. So there can be 5 people in the queue, but you have the least amount of time. You raise your hand, you go right to the top. is the idea there.
So who was the loudmouth in that?
Michael.
Oh, and then we have this fun statistic at the end apparently
We
too.
have to blame Steve for that, though.
How so?
I think you're not holding up your end of the table. You might want to hear more.
The score is here.
Thank you.
Since I'm the presenter, technically I should by default have a majority of the time. I mean,
Not
But-
really.
yeah, I made a really short presentation this time. I wanted to be more discussion to see how that would go.
I think that this is good in that the presentation shouldn't dominate. I think it's,
Yeah.
I think if the purpose of the presentation ideally is just to kind of keep the conversation moving.
Yeah.
But as soon as it becomes a presentation, that's not what I'm.
Yeah, and I try to research a little bit so that I have some figures and stuff to get the juices flowing is the kind of the idea. But yeah, I don't want it to dominate the discussion.
By the way, I think
Yeah.
gang is another definition like terrorism. It kind of depends who's calling it. For example, Greenpeace by